And so the Japanese automotive manufacturers in particular in the 1970s and 80s changed how they did manufacturing from being mass producers to flexible producers, flexible production. And so essentially flexible production, the idea is it adapts to changing tastes. Different model, you can change different models. And so what was happening, we were mass producing same, but now everyone had cars. Now we want different, we have different uses. Some have big families, and so we want a big car. Some have small families. Maybe they want a sports car. Maybe they want a fast car. And so you might have different climate regions in the United States in which they want different cars. Maybe men and women want different cars. And so over time, flexible production adapted to those changing tastes. And so they could then change the models quite quickly. Whereas in the old factories, it would take a huge amount of work to change the assembly line from one vehicle to the next vehicle. With the Japanese, their assembly lines were adaptable. They could adapt to changing models, and so they were built to be flexible. A whole lot of other reasons why, I'll explain why the Japanese dominated, but that all relates to efficiency. And so instead of cranking out a ton of vehicles and hoping that consumers want them, the Japanese were kind of more made to order. And so they rely on something called just-in-time delivery, which, if I can summarize as simply as possible, I would say it's all about getting the right material at the right time, in the right place, in the exact amount. So we go back to the previous Ford era. Everything was manufactured in a massive, huge facility and then was stored in a big, huge warehouse with the hope, and they maybe pray every night, that we hope that those cars get sold. If not, we have a whole lot of metal just sitting in a room in which they have to constantly be dusted and the air controlled and all of that. So a lot of inventory costs associated with mass production. With the just-in-time delivery, the Japanese innovation that was essentially globalized across the world and changed manufacturing, it was definitely all about reducing inventory, reducing the associated costs, and eliminating waste. Further, they relied on what they call the Kanban System, Kanban. And so what that is they rely on their suppliers to do a lot of the work that the mass producers used to do inside their facility. So instead of manufacturing the tires, or putting the wheels on, instead of manufacturing the chassis, instead of manufacturing all the individual components of the car inside the facility, what the Japanese did was they relied on suppliers to do that for them. And so what they would do is they'd have a couple suppliers, for example, chassis suppliers. The chassis is the main base of the car. So what they would do is with having a couple suppliers, if all of a sudden one screws up, you can go to the other one. Further, this is a beauty. Competition is a good thing. And so sometimes when you get your suppliers competing against each other, they're going to innovate, come up with a better product, or even better, they're going to come up with a cheaper cost for you. So then what that does is that then also reduces costs. And so once again, it's all about efficiency. And so the Japanese were very innovative as far as being much more efficient as far as reducing inventory costs, but also reducing costs by having their suppliers very much compete against each other, and then that also lowered the costs. So further, what they did was they developed this Kanban system. So essentially, what would happen is signals or information would just be automatically given to those suppliers and said, hey, we need a bunch of cars here, and we need these cars right now. Suddenly, there's a run on a particular model. We already know this as an example. Every time you go to Walmart or to a grocery store, every time you scan that island, beep, as it goes across the scanner. Essentially a big computer storing all that information. And so let's say all of a sudden number 2 pencils. There's a big run on number 2 pencils. Let's say it's the beginning of the school year. And all of a sudden people are buying huge numbers of number 2 pencils to get little Johnny, little Susie ready for school. Beep, 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 beep. And so what would happen is then the inventory would then be, notice that, whoa, we don't have any number 2 pencils. And so the number 2 pencil manufacturer or distributor would be, they would let them know. And suddenly all those number 2 pencils would be delivered as quick as possible to that particular Walmart or particular grocery store. Same idea was innovated as far as from the Japanese, and that was all about their suppliers. And so the suppliers were given information that's called this Kanban system, kind of an alert that say, hey, we need these materials and we need them now. Another innovation is something called Kaizen, or K-A-I-Z-E-N, Kaizen. So essentially that's a Japanese term that says, I think this is loosely translated, make better. So essentially what they did was the Japanese also were innovative in the fact they included workers in terms of the overall design of the facility. So once again, I emphasize that for a reason. Mass production, workers, and the management were separate. A lot of the Japanese firms, a lot of the Japanese companies that have invested in the United States to develop their flexible production systems, actually the managers and the owners of the place won't even have an office to try to make it clear that, hey, they're one of you. And so what this is by including the workers, you get their feedback. How can we make this even better? How can we make this even more efficient? And so by including the workers, this was seen as another task to, once again, quote, make better. Further, the workers, they would change their task over time. You would not do the same thing over and over and over. How monotonous, how boring, how unworthwhile is your existence if you do the same thing over and over and over for 40 years. And so what the Japanese did was they wanted to include the workers, but also move the workers around so you have kind of these different tasks. And so once again, by moving workers around, you have a new perspective. And so why not ask the people who actually are on the floor doing the manufacturing how to make things better instead of trying to come up with these assumptions from afar. And so this is once again another technique that we see now imitated and mimicked by U.S. manufacturers across the board in terms of different industries beyond just cars. So here I have a graphic that shows mass production. And so we have a big, huge assembly plant where everything is manufactured, everything is put together, everything, all components of the car are assembled here in this massive facility. Then they go to inventory. They go into a big warehouse. And so hopefully they go straight to a consumer. Hopefully they go straight to showrooms across the country. But if they don't, they just sit here in this big, huge, massive facility that someone has to heat, cool, dust, keep track of, and all of that. Further, once they're in inventory, let's hope that consumers want these products. And so you crank out a bunch of these cars with the hopes that, well, let's hope they sell. If not, you've got a lot of metal here, a lot of various scraps that will then cause, of course, the overall cost to lower considerably because no one wants these things. And so it's all about supply and demand. In the case of flexible production, what they do is they change everything. So the inventory, if it even exists, is much smaller. Further, it's more made to order or custom made or just in time, in which the assembly plant would often be crank out a car that would go directly to a consumer, go directly to a car dealership. What they also do is, like I said beforehand, they would have several suppliers. And so you'd have the tire and the wheel suppliers, the chassis suppliers, the dashboard suppliers. I mean, these are just examples, rough examples. And so what would happen? They would start competing against each other. They would start innovating, come up with better products, yada, yada, yada. And all of that is much more efficient. Let people who specialize in that, chassis, let them specialize and develop and come up with more innovative techniques. All of this reduce costs. Which once again we look, why were the Japanese automotive manufacturers so successful? First off, they adapted to changing tastes. Across the world, people were more focused and more interested in fuel efficiency. So they wanted cars in which they could go farther distances on a tank of gas. Where the mass production was more about cranking out muscle cars, big huge heavy engines, which are badass things. I've nothing cooler than a big ass huge engine, but if not everyone wants one, that's not as cool. Further, why do people buy cars? Why do people go to Walmart? Why do people buy anything? Usually it's because it's cheaper, it's a better cost. And so all these cost savings, not only were they more fuel efficient cars that people were wanting, they're also cheaper cars. And if I can get a car for $19,000, hey, I'm happy, I'm good, that's all I need. Here's a great way to showcase the success of the Japanese automotive manufacturers who, in 2010, were the 1st, 6th, 7th, 9th, 15th, and 16th in terms of the different companies that were tops in the world. So this is this huge factor. All this flexible production is huge to understanding the success of Toyota and Honda. Further, this was imitated by manufacturers, all these here on this list, essentially copied this particular technique. And so plagiarism in action. So this was also imitated by manufacturers in all types of industries globally and worldwide. So here we could say this is a great example of internationalization and globalization of today in terms of the movement of ideas. So here we have a map. This is a kind of a dated map, but still nonetheless useful. And so what we can see is we can see a lot of these green dots are domestic assembly plants. So those are domestic automotive manufacturers. And so think of those as the big three: Ford, GM, and Dodge. And so we have the blue dots are the foreign assembly plants. And so those are going to be, for example, Honda, Toyota, Mitsubishi, Hyundai. And so once again, this is outdated. So there's been some new ones that have popped up in Indiana, but the only foreign assembly plant that's shown in Indiana is the one in Princeton, Indiana, there near Evansville. That's a Toyota plant. But nonetheless, what we have with this map is we can see a new pattern. So what's happened is the pattern has changed. So the foreign assembly plants have kind of found the Midwest and some of the South to be attractive. They've opened up some new plants there. But what they've done is they've taken advantage of a couple different things. First off, the transportation network. If we look at where a lot of these foreign assembly plants are, they're located along major interstates. Why? Because it's all related to, once again, being close to your suppliers. And so relying on suppliers, essentially what's happening is the interstates and the transportation network is being used as what was historically the assembly line. So in the old days, that would have been all inside a plant, kind of the assembly going from one part to the next. Now what happens is essentially the interstates are the conveyor belt that bring the desired materials, desired products from the suppliers to the assembly plant. Further, they're also locating closer to where we find more and more consumers. So a lot of the new United States automotive plants have kind of mimicked the same idea and opened up new facilities throughout the Midwest and parts of the South that we can see here. And that was all about reducing cost. So if they located way up in the northeastern part of the United States, much of the population is moving farther to the south and to the west, as we've already identified. And so it makes sense to be closer to where a large number of your consumers are. So what would happen is distribution costs have been reduced by, first off, locating near all these interstates that come through the Midwest and the South, but also being closer to a large number of consumers. And just to make sure, just to reiterate something I've said before, I just wanted to once again show this map that shows how the population of the United States has over time moved to the west and to the south. And so key to that is out-migration in the north and in the east, and then in-migration to the south and the west. And all of that relates to industrialization. So in the north and the east, deindustrialization, and in the south and the west, I guess industrialization or reindustrialization, if that's even a word. Not only have we seen the assembly plants move to the Midwest and to this area in the South, but of course, with the increasingly flexible production being used by both domestic and foreign assembly plant and manufacturers, those who make car parts, whether it be car parts for that are being critical to the assembly of a vehicle, or aftermarket car parts, have essentially located near their customers the assembly plants. And so you're also seeing, once again, the benefits. And not only do these assembly plants come to an area, bring jobs, but they also rely on nearby suppliers. And so that also adds even more jobs. And so this is something I'm going to emphasize more when I look at Indiana specifically. We'll look at Greensburg, Indiana, and the Honda plant that was, the Honda assembly plant that was built there, and how that's benefited a lot of surrounding areas as a lot of other suppliers, a lot of other car part suppliers, either before market or aftermarket car part suppliers have also benefited. And some of them are even Japanese of origin. Some have always been in the United States, have been here way back when they supplied car parts for the big three, the automotive industry way back when they're in Detroit. And so what we have is this kind of this geography now to manufacturing that kind of makes a little bit more sense. It's more than just some guy talking about business. And I actually have my own personal connection to this. And so my grandfather worked for many, many years for a company called American Motors. They're famous for the Pinto, the Gremlin, all kinds of cars that blew up. So they actually went out of business there in the early 80s. So then, because of that, my grandpa, he had to find another job. And so he was actually, because he was an upper level worker there in Detroit, he was actually contacted by the Japanese, by Honda. And he was part of a group that was helping them come up with their best strategy to open up a new assembly plant. And so, once again, they realized that they could save money instead of shipping cars from Japan all the way across the Pacific Ocean in that heavy, heavy car and all the transportation costs associated with that. Why not just build the car here in the United States close to the customers? So they thought, well, where should we put our brand new facility? And my grandpa suggested, amongst a few other people, somewhere probably in Ohio, somewhere along I-75. And so if you're going to be flexible production, if you're going to rely on suppliers, why not locate near a lot of the big three suppliers, a lot of the Detroit automotive suppliers, but also locate there near interstates. And so you got Interstate 70 not too far away, you got Interstate 75, Interstate 71, so you got all these interstates that made it a very, very attractive location. And we can see the very first ever plant was in Marysville, Ohio, which is today one of North America Honda's headquarters, and that's highlighted there. But also in nearby Ohio, in East Liberty, Ohio, was where they assembled the Honda Element that I drive. And so this isn't my car, this is a stock image, but the Honda Element, very, very, very cool car, very great car that they no longer use, but it's a great way to showcase a few different things. And so first off, cost. So that's why I bought it, was because I got a brand new car for $17,000, which was quite affordable. Further, it was built on an assembly line, essentially, that they also could build Honda Accords on. So this is essentially a Honda Accord engine, Honda Accord frame, just with a different body. And so once again, they could adapt to changing tastes. And so a different model car essentially could be manufactured in the same as this Honda Element. And so further, this was built in East Liberty, Ohio. And so the people who made this car were Americans. And so this gets us to, once again, these interesting contradictions and what do you call them kind of situations. Here, is it a foreign car? Well, yeah, it's a foreign manufacturer. It's Honda, who is, Soichiro Honda was the founder there. He's a Japanese guy. But the people who made it, the people who assembled it, the people who put it together were Americans. Even worse, they're Ohioans. They're buckheads from Ohio. And so what we kind of see here is the example of how, when we think about foreign direct investment, we think about globalization and GDP versus GDP, it's kind of convoluted. And so we have to think about, we have to put it in perspective.